We know that throughout the history of America, there have been assassinations and assassination attempts on U.S. presidents. 4 sitting presidents have been assassinated: Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. Ronald Reagan was also wounded in an assassination attempt while he was president, and Theodore Roosevelt and Donald Trump were also wounded in an assassination attempt, both of whom were out of office at the time, but were campaigning for an election. Now, many people may not know that the first assassination attempt on a U.S. president dates back to 1835, over 20 years before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And in 1835, an assassin attempted to take Andrew Jackson's life. And this attempt actually led to the president attacking the would-be assassin. Hello everybody, my name is Adam, and this is the U.S. History Unlocked podcast, where we look into historical events, people, places, and facts that relate to the United States. As always, if you ever have any ideas or events you'd like discussed, please feel free to share, to comment them, and we may look into those topics in a future episode. But let's get into today's topic, which is the first assassination attempt on a U.S. president. So Andrew Jackson was a very notable president, and he served 2 terms from 1829 to 1837. Overall, he was known as a very tough and combative man. He never backed down from fights, whether the fight be physical or political, and he also took part in at least 2 confirmed duels, although people speculate that Jackson might have been involved in many more duels. Now, interestingly, one of these duels took place in 1806, and Jackson was actually shot in the chest, and he lived with the bullet lodged in his body for the rest of his life. So this just goes to show that Jackson was a very fearless man who did not back away from conflict. Now, he really rose to fame due to his actions in the War of 1812, which that whole topic might warrant its own episode in the future. And Jackson actually ran for president in 1824, and he won a majority of the popular vote. But no candidate had a majority of the electoral votes, so this led to a whole election in the House of Representatives that resulted in John Quincy Adams becoming president, and this also probably warrants its own episode in the future. But anyways, Andrew Jackson became president in 1828, was inaugurated in 1829 in a landslide election where he defeated John Quincy Adams. He was then reelected in 1832 in another landslide election, and a notable topic throughout this election and throughout his presidency was the Second Bank of the United States. And this directly ties into the attempt to take his life. So the Second Bank of the United States was a federally chartered bank, and Andrew Jackson heavily opposed this bank. He vetoed a recharter of the bank in 1832, a couple months before the election, and during his second term, he then removed the federal deposits in the banks, and he placed the federal deposits into private banks. So we now find Andrew Jackson in 1835, halfway through his second term as president, and he essentially made the Second Bank of the United States powerless. Now again, this directly contributes to the attempt to take his life. In January of 1835, before the assassination attempt, John C. Calhoun called for a Brutus. So why is this significant? Well, John C. Calhoun, first off, he was Jackson's vice president during his first term, but then he resigned as vice president, and he was an enemy of Andrew Jackson's. And Brutus, if you know, was the most famous assassin of Julius Caesar. So John C. Calhoun seemed to be calling for someone to assassinate Andrew Jackson, and this will come into play near the end of this episode, so just keep that in mind. So now let's shift to the would-be assassin. His name was Richard Lawrence. He was a house painter, but he was unemployed at the time of the assassination attempt, and he was mentally unstable. And some people have speculated that this was due to his constant exposure to dangerous chemicals in paint, and he was a house painter, and he would paint a lot and be exposed to these dangerous chemicals. Now, he seemed to start going insane beginning around 1832. He sporadically traveled to England and other areas in the U.S. When he quit his job as a house painter, Lawrence believed that the U.S. government owed him money because he thought he was King Richard III of England and owned estates in England. Now keep in mind, King Richard III of England was king around 350 years before Richard Lawrence. So again, just kind of goes to show that he wasn't all there because he thought he was a king of England who was alive a couple centuries before him. And this is how Lawrence, he started getting the idea to assassinate Andrew Jackson. Because remember, Jackson made the Second National Bank powerless, and he removed the federal deposits from the bank. Now, Lawrence believed that this was preventing him from getting the money he was owed due to him being King Richard III, but he couldn't get the money because the second bank had the federal deposits removed from it. So Lawrence thought that if Andrew Jackson were to die and the vice president, Martin Van Buren, would become president, Van Buren would reestablish the bank and Lawrence could then get the money that he deserved. And leading up to the assassination, Lawrence would supposedly talk to himself a lot about Andrew Jackson. So he has this idea in mind to assassinate Andrew Jackson in order to get money from the Second Bank of the United States because he thought he was King Richard III and was owed money by the government. So this now brings us to January 30th, 1835, the day of the assassination attempt of President Andrew Jackson. So in the morning of January 30th, Richard Lawrence supposedly was laughing, and he then got up saying, "I'll be damned if I don't do it," supposedly referring to the assassination attempt. So on that day, Andrew Jackson was attending the funeral of South Carolina Representative Warren R. Davis at the U.S. Capitol building. And Lawrence's original plan was to assassinate Jackson as he was entering the Capitol building, but Lawrence didn't get close enough to Jackson, so he couldn't get a shot off. He then decided to attempt it as Jackson left the funeral and left the building. So at this time, Jackson was not in the best of health, and he needed a cane to walk around and also had to lean on someone while he was walking. So as Jackson is leaving the Capitol building, walking with his cane, Lawrence stepped out behind a pillar and fired his pistol at the back of Jackson. However, the gun misfired, so Jackson was fine. Jackson then charged after Lawrence with his cane and beat him with his cane. Lawrence was able to pull out a second pistol he had and again fired at Jackson, but the gun had another misfire. So during this whole altercation, Jackson beat Lawrence several times with his cane. Spectators and those around Jackson eventually tackled Lawrence and took him away, and Andrew Jackson was taken back to the White House. So this was the first ever assassination attempt on a U.S. president. And it's unlike any other assassination attempt, as the sitting U.S. president defended himself and actually attacked the would-be assassin, which is very interesting. So in the aftermath of this, nothing happened to Andrew Jackson, obviously, because both of the shots misfired and he was completely fine. So he served out the remainder of his second term, and he would then pass away around 10 years later. But as for Richard Lawrence, his assassination trial began 2 months later, and interestingly, the prosecutor in the trial was Francis Scott Key, who wrote the poem that eventually became the national anthem. But after only 5 minutes of the jury deliberating, they found Lawrence not guilty by reason of insanity, and he spent the remainder of his life in institutions and in hospitals, and eventually passed away in 1861. Now, as for the political aftermath of this, Andrew Jackson and his supporters accused those in the Whig Party, as well as John C. Calhoun, of being involved in a plot to assassinate him. So recall that John C. Calhoun called for a Brutus just before the assassination attempt on Jackson. So that was not a good look on Calhoun, essentially calling for someone to assassinate Jackson, and then someone actually attempts to assassinate Jackson. However, Calhoun denied any involvement in the assassination, and this whole case, this whole conspiracy was eventually put to rest. So that's the first assassination attempt on a U.S. president. We have Richard Lawrence trying to shoot Andrew Jackson twice, but the gun misfired, and Andrew Jackson then beat Lawrence with his cane. This is an interesting event in American history that could have resulted in the first assassination of a U.S. president and the first death of a U.S. president while in office, but that didn't happen, And again, an assassination attempt unlike any other one, as the sitting US president attacks his would-be assassin. That's it for today's episode. Thank you all for listening. Please feel free to share this episode. Again, leave any ideas that you have in the comments and we may discuss them in a future episode. With that being said, take care, everybody. I'll see you here again next week.